The conversation of buying versus renting a home is getting ridiculous. I'm seeing more and more well-respected finance people suggest that renting may be preferable to buying a home, and even going so far as to say that owning a property isn't a good idea. But it just isn't that simple, so please don't listen to that advice. In this video, I'm going to go through whether it really is better to rent or own your home, considering it from both an investment point of view and looking at the wider economic landscape, considering the current uncertainty we're facing at the moment, but also how it can affect your overall well-being and other factors that you should consider. So hopefully you'll be able to feel informed and understand what might be right for your personal situation. But before we get into it, if you are new around here, my name's Alex, and I'm a property owner and retail investor with over a decade's worth of experience. And if you're interested in seeing more content around personal finance, investing, and trying to chase that goal of financial freedom, then make sure you hit that subscribe button down below to stay up to date with all of my latest posts. But with that being said, I am not a financial advisor, and none of this information should be taken as financial advice. But with all of that out the way, let's get into it. Now, when you're considering whether or not to rent or own your home, the first thing you should really think about is your lifestyle before getting into any of the finances. You should first be asking yourself the question of where are you planning on living long term? Are you settled in one particular area, or have you found somewhere that you do want to live for the long term? If so, buying, or at least aspiring to buy, is likely to be a logical decision. This can bring you a lot of extra freedom and security, knowing that you don't have to worry about being evicted by anyone, because you're the property owner and there's no landlord to deal with. You're also free to do pretty much whatever you want to do to the property within regulations, to make the home exactly how you want it to suit your exact needs. Any money that you do spend on the property could also be considered an investment, as it could potentially increase the property's value. On the other hand though, if you don't fit into this category and maybe you move around a lot for work, maybe renting might be the more logical option, as it could give you far more flexibility if you want to move again in the future. You most likely won't have to deal with the hassle of furnishing the property, and also the upfront costs will be a lot less. With that being said though, personally I don't believe that you should rule out owning a property even if you are in this situation. If a great opportunity presents itself to own the property that you live in, and you have the means to do so, it might be a very good idea to go ahead with it, even if you are planning on moving again in the future. People think that owning a property can be a huge tie and limit your flexibility, but actually it's not true. If you do want or need to move somewhere else, you can always rent out that property that you own and go rent somewhere else yourself. And financially, it will probably work out around the same. However, you'll have the added benefit of owning a property, which is a great asset to have. Now, once you've considered your lifestyle and overall situation, the next thing to look at is whether or not buying a property is a good investment. To work this out, let's first look at average UK house prices. So both over a medium and a long time horizon, property values have increased in price. When we look a bit closer, there tend to be shorter term corrections that do happen, and sometimes prices can decrease. But looking at this data, the house prices do recover within 10 years. For example, if we look here at the 2008 financial crisis. Property prices have also significantly outperformed the UK stock market and are about on par with the US stock market when comparing average UK house prices to the FTSE 100 and S&P 500. Well, this would suggest that owning a property is without a doubt a good investment, right? Well, it's not quite that simple. Average house prices tend to track CPI, which is the Consumer Price Index, very closely. And CPI is generally considered one of the main measures of inflation. And so what this means is, even though house prices are going up, the actual house values aren't really changing because of inflation. So considering this, I wouldn't really say it's a good investment, but instead frame it a bit differently and say it's a good store of value. So for example, if you had £100,000 10 years ago, to maintain that same purchasing power back then, today, that money would need to go up in value to £134,000. So just keeping that money for 10 years in a bank, you're just losing purchasing power to inflation. Whereas if you put that money into a property, the chances are the property value would have increased at a similar rate to inflation, which would help to protect your purchasing power. If you're competent at investing in other asset classes like the stock market, where you can beat inflation, then that's a fine alternative. But simply keeping your money in a savings account where interest rates don't keep up with inflation is not a good idea, and investing that money instead into a property will most likely be a better option. With all of this considered though, you have to remember that not all properties are a good investment, and there are always potential risks where you could get unlucky. For example, the property you buy may have a bad survey carried out and you realise that there's lots of structural damage that you need to have repaired, which could cost you a fortune. It could also be in a location that suddenly becomes undesirable and then difficult to sell. There could be environmental things to consider if you're close to the coast or a river maybe, and potentially you're on a floodplain. Or you could even just have unpleasant neighbours who make the property difficult to sell. But the important thing to remember is that there are always risks when buying a property. Now, another thing to consider when looking at property as a potential investment is the fact that most people use a mortgage facility, and it's therefore a leveraged investment. And honestly, this is the best kind of leveraged investment you could pretty much ever get. What makes this so important is that rather than having to pay for the entire value of the property upfront in cash, you can pay for just a portion and then take out the rest as a mortgage. And using this type of borrowing facility or leverage can be a great way to increase your return on investment. So providing the house value does continue to increase, you'll be getting a higher rate of return if you have just a deposit and a mortgage, compared to if you bought the entire property outright in cash. For example, if you bought a property worth £100,000 with a 20% deposit, which would be £20,000 that you've invested into that property, and take out the other 80% as a mortgage, if the value of that property increases by 10%, that would bring the total to £110,000, which is a £10,000 total profit. Now, rather than the bank getting a portion of this profit, that all goes to you and is added equity into your property. And so if you were to then sell this property, your return on investment, instead of being 10%, would actually be 50%, as you've now increased your initial investment of £20,000 up to £30,000 that you'd get back if you sold the property. Obviously, you would have to deduct the monthly payments and the interest that you're paying on the mortgage, but it is quite staggering how using leverage can just increase your return on investment so significantly. And honestly, as an individual or a retail investor, I think a mortgage facility is one of the best leveraged opportunities that you can use within the financial markets. Now, all of this does sound great, but there's one final thing that you have to remember before you get too excited. Often the profit that you make on a property won't actually be realised, assuming that you own one property and it's the home that you live in. One reason is that you can't simply sell your property and then pocket the cash, because you're still going to need somewhere to live. And let's say you want to move house and your house has increased in value. It's not as if the rest of the property market has done nothing while your house has been increasing in value. So even though you might have made £10,000 like with this previous example, your buying power with that extra £10,000 won't have changed. So you'll still be in the same situation unless you're prepared to take out a bigger mortgage or you've got more savings to put into the next property. And so hopefully what this reinforces is that owning a property is simply a good store of value, and it should protect you from having your buying power eroded if you weren't to invest in anything. So overall, when weighing up which is better, owning or renting your home, from strictly a long-term investment point of view, owning a property is without a doubt a better option, assuming that you've got no other investments. However, if you're competent at investing in other asset classes, where you can protect your money from inflation, then you don't need to buy a property, and renting might actually be a better option if it suits your lifestyle better. But if you have no interest in investing in other asset classes, then you really should be trying to get onto the property ladder. Now, with all of that considered, you really should only be buying a property if you genuinely can afford to do so. And buying a property is a costly process that should not be overlooked. The first thing to consider are the upfront purchasing costs, which include legal fees, stamp duty, estate agent fees, and having to carry out things like surveys. These costs will vary depending on the type and the value of the property that you're purchasing, but we're talking around £5,000 at a minimum. Whereas comparing this to renting somewhere, you don't have these same upfront costs. Instead, what you'd have is a damage deposit, which is usually around 1 month's rent upfront. Although, assuming you haven't damaged the property in any way, this is usually a refundable deposit, which you'll get back when leaving the property. But when buying a property, you don't get any of these expenses back. When buying, you also have to consider the costs of furnishing the property. As an example, I've tried to furnish my property as cheaply as possible, and it's a 3-bedroom house, but all in all, it still cost around £20,000, despite getting things second-hand and trying to find as many deals as possible. Whereas with renting, often rental properties will come furnished, so you don't really have to buy any furniture yourself, which is a great cost saving. Some rental properties do, however, come unfurnished, and honestly, I would steer clear of these, because you don't want to be buying temporary furniture for someone else's house that also might not fit the next place that you choose to move to. So it just ends up being a huge waste of money. When owning a property, you also have the unexpected costs, which could crop up at any moment. For example, this could be for unexpected repairs if you need to get a plumber or an electrician out, or if your washing machine breaks and you have to replace it. All things like this are going to be your responsibility, and you're going to have to be prepared for the unexpected. Whereas with renting, assuming you have a responsible landlord, you shouldn't actually have to worry about any of these potential unexpected costs. But one of the most important things to consider are going to be your monthly payments. Now, it doesn't matter if you own or rent your home, you're still going to have monthly bills coming your way. So that'd be things like paying for energy, water, Wi-Fi, and council tax. But the thing that really matters is the comparison between your monthly rent and your monthly mortgage payments. Now, in theory, having monthly mortgage payments would be far preferable to having monthly rental payments, because that money that you're paying every month is simply going to pay off a loan that you've taken out on an asset. Whereas with renting, that money's going straight to your landlord into their pocket, and maybe it's going towards paying off the mortgage on their asset. But unfortunately, it's not quite that simple, and there are scenarios where it'd be cheaper to be paying rent compared to paying a mortgage on a like-for-like property, and vice versa. The two things that have the biggest influence on this are the interest rates and size of your deposit. Looking at these two similar 4-bed London properties as an example, you can see that the monthly rental payments are significantly cheaper than if you were to take out a mortgage with a 10% deposit at current interest rates. However, if we do one simple thing and lower interest rates to 2%, which is what they were at around 2 years ago, you can see that the monthly costs are now pretty much level. And so here you can see very clearly how much of an influence interest rates have. And back then, it was a no-brainer to own a property if you have the means, compared to renting. But with the interest rates we're experiencing today, it's not as clear-cut. Now, like I said, the other big factor is your deposit size. So if we go back and put the interest rates back to what they were, but now increase the deposit size from 10% up to 20%, you can see that the monthly payments are still significantly more expensive than it would be to rent. However, at this point, you might deem it an acceptable trade-off, because you're paying a slight premium each month, but it's going towards paying off an asset that you own. Whereas with renting, it's slightly cheaper short term, but essentially that money's going down the drain. But if we increase the deposit size again up to 40%, things start to look a lot more favourable. Once you have a 40% deposit on a property, you'll be getting the best interest rates out there, so you can expect your borrowing costs to come down slightly. And you can see with this example, it now brings the monthly mortgage payments about on par with the monthly rental payments. However, this is just one example, and depending on your area, things might vary. But to me, what this demonstrates is that you should only be buying a property if you can comfortably afford to do so. And I would say ideally that means having between a 20 and a 40% deposit. But if interest rates do start to come down, you may be able to get away with having a smaller deposit. Although I would be very wary of buying a property with anything less than a 10% deposit, so steer well clear of those 95% mortgages. Now, the final thing to consider is the current and future economic outlook, and how this might affect the property market to decide whether or not now is a good or a horrible time to get onto the property ladder. Many people, including myself, believe that at the moment the property market is overvalued. Property prices have gone up so much over the last 10 years, and last year in 2023 we've seen a decline of around 1%, which isn't really a lot. I believe that if interest rates remain high and don't drop back to what they used to be around 2 years ago, we're going to see a further decline in overall house values. To what extent? I don't know. The reason for this is that as more and more people's fixed-term mortgage deals come to an end, they're going to have to remortgage at a higher interest rate, and they're potentially not going to be able to afford these new higher payments. This could lead people into having to try and sell their properties quickly, and therefore lowering the prices to do so. As a result, this could lead to other sellers having to lower their prices to remain competitive, and overall we could just see a drop in house prices. If interest rates do start to come back down though, I don't think this will happen. But what does this mean for you if you're currently thinking about whether or not to buy a property? If you can comfortably afford to do so and have around a 20% deposit, and you're going to be able to afford the monthly payments with the current interest rates, and you're thinking long term and will be happy to own that property for at least 10 years, then I'd say definitely go ahead and try and get onto the property ladder, especially if you don't have any other investments. Short term, the house could go down in value, but it doesn't actually matter if you're thinking long term, as if we look at previous data, it suggests that overall house prices will recover and continue to go up in the future over the long term. Also, because of the economic uncertainty and cost of living crisis, there are going to be some great deals out there. So you're just going to have to keep your eyes open and keep looking. Although if you're not currently in a financial situation where you can comfortably buy a property, it might be worth avoiding at this current moment. You shouldn't be overstretching yourself to try and tick that box of owning a property. If house prices do continue to decline, you can leave yourself exposed to massive risk where you might be forced to sell your property at a loss. And honestly, it's just not worth it. Unfortunately, if you are in this situation though, renting may be what you have to do. But there are still ways in which you can look to try and save money. For example, you could try and live with family if that's a possibility, or live with friends in a house share to try and reduce your monthly rent. But the most important thing that you need to do is make sure that you're saving as much money as possible. And there are government schemes out there to help you, like the Lifetime ISA, which is a great thing to use, where you can basically get £1,000 free from the government if you're saving towards your first property. Basically how it works is whatever you deposit into the account, the government will top up 25% on top of that, up to a maximum deposit of £4,000. But saving money and keeping it in a savings account simply won't be enough. You're going to have to learn how to invest. Otherwise you're leaving yourself massively at risk of having your savings get eaten away by inflation. If you do want to learn how to invest though, I'll leave a link on screen now to my most recent video going over exactly how to invest in the stock market as a complete beginner, and I'll break down 5 simple hacks that anyone can use to start making money on the stock market. But if you did make it this far, thank you so much for watching, and make sure to hit that subscribe button down below and click that bell to stay up to date with all of my latest content. But with all of that being said, take it easy and enjoy the rest of your day.